What's up guys, Vulkan here, and today we have a heavy dose of news for Diablo 4. Now each quarter they push out a new update of where they are on the game, they get player feedback on designs, they discuss the next steps, and really it's interesting to see a Blizzard game done like this. Most of the time we see this with indie titles, but I really like seeing the steps in the process, helping provide feedback, and getting a little insight into how Blizzard designs their games. So this quarterly update focuses on a few things: the team playtest, storytelling, open world, multiplayer, and items and progression. So let's kick things off with the playtest. So the team dove into a region called the Dry Steppes and completed campaign content, open world elements, the new itemization changes, a PvP subzone, dungeons, and a cinematic. Now the goal here is to have the team play the game from home over 2 full days, and then come back and discuss their reactions. So there isn't really a lot of meat in this section for new info, but it is cool to see how they organize group efforts for testing certain zones. Most of the time they test individual components or individual systems, so they don't really get to see how everything plays together. So next up is storytelling and conversations in Diablo 4. These are going to look a little bit different. So in Diablo 3, they relied heavily on UI panes with the character's name and their portrait, but in Diablo 4, they're going to have some choreographed cameras that show various angles and help give depth to interactions. So for simple conversations, they're just going to bring the camera in closer to really kind of make the world fade away in the background and highlight those characters right in the center of the screen. For more complex ones, they're going to handcraft the animations, the character actions, the movements specifically for that conversation to help convey what they want to. And another thing they're working on are called real-time cutscenes, or RTCs. And this is where the game will grab your camera and treat the storytelling like it's a movie. But they did mention these are going to be reserved for the most important moments in the game to drive home important key elements that they would like to. Now the ultimate goal here is to deliver deep, meaningful story moments to help immerse the player in the story. I think this is going to be a lot more immersive than just having a UI pane pop up, but until we see how it actually acts and plays out, we can't really say for sure. So the next thing I want to jump into is open world, and this is one of the main new features coming to Diablo. I mean, when I first saw this at the reveal, I was ecstatic. I mean, I love the idea of an open world Diablo and what a company like Blizzard will be able to do with all of that space. What hidden things are going to be tucked away, and really it reminded me of Grim Dawn in lots of different ways. Grim Dawn's areas are massive. I mean, they're pretty big zones, and there's all sorts of just cool stuff kind of tucked away in all the nooks and crannies. So having something like that in a Diablo game would be fantastic. So this section is great. It discusses some of what we'll find, how the areas will play out. First things first, out in the world, you're going to see things like crafting elements, materials, things like that, world events, world PvP, subzones, side quests. And the way Blizzard really imagine how zones will flow for players is they're going to work on the campaign for a little bit, then take a break, do some side quests, do some exploring, maybe some PvP, crafting. If there's a world event that pops up, it's going to pull them off the beaten path a little bit. And it really feels like they're taking heavily from World of Warcraft with all of these elements. And honestly, I don't mind. I mean, I play World of Warcraft, I still to this day, I've played since vanilla. It's just something that I like to do. And I think some of these elements will translate fairly well if they are executed properly. So I am a little skeptical on the PvP subzones. But I think as long as they function a little bit like Cyrodiil from Elder Scrolls Online, then I'm not going to mind it too much. And for those out of the loop, Cyrodiil is an area of the world in Elder Scrolls Online that functions like any other zone, right? You can find most of the stuff there, mobs, crafting materials, bosses, things like that, but it's also where all of the open world PvP is hosted, which is nice because you understand, okay, I'm entering this zone, it's going to have risks, I can get killed here. Now, part 2 of my skepticism is hoping that Blizzard doesn't do something silly and put some of the best materials or best bosses in PvP zones only for the sake of risk versus reward. That, in my opinion, would be a massive mistake. Diablo at its heart is a PvE game. PvP is a great side addition, it's a great thing for people that really want it, but it is not the main focus, right? It is not the headliner, it's an opening act. So I think as long as they continue to treat it like that, then it'll be okay. Just have it there as a side gig. Now, the other interesting things about open world are camps. These are locations of importance that were overrun by enemies that the player then has to go clear out. Once you purge all the enemies, these locations will actually fill up with friendly NPCs, and it adds a waypoint that you can teleport to. Now, these are loosely tied to the story and are mostly discovered by exploring. So the main campaign isn't going to take you through all of them. It's not going to hold your hand and go, okay, we're going to go from this hub to this town to this camp to this hub. And I really like this approach. I think it gives incentive for getting off the beaten path and looking for things yourself. And believe me, I completely understand. There's going to be a map of all the camp locations on like day 2 of the game's release. But still, right, if you don't look at that map, but it also makes you wonder, what else do they have hidden out there? So what is undiscovered? And I think something like that would be really, really cool in a game like Diablo. So let's get back to the actual playtest of the open world. Now, they mentioned it took team members several hours to clear each zone. Those who focused on the story only finished in about half the time, while those who took breaks to do other content finished a little bit after or at that time. They didn't mention the time, they just said several hours, which could range from 3 hours to 5 hours. Several is a very flexible term for a lot of people. They also mentioned that apparently there will be mounts in the game that offer itemization. They designed these mounts to move quickly without trivializing combat or travel, and some of the itemization are things like a trophy you can attach to show off what you've earned, like attached to your saddle, and they're really, really excited for these. I think it's going to be interesting to see how mounts work in an action RPG, because I've seen them done well in games like Diablo. I've seen them done extremely poorly in games like Guardians of Ember, and I've seen them just not included at all because they're too difficult to manage or implement or add in, and that seems to be the case for a lot of action RPGs out there. They would much rather rely on either movement speed boosts or design zones to be able to be basically walked most of the time. So if they have mounts, then I'm imagining these are going to be fairly massive zones that we're going to go through and explore. So take that as you will. Now, I want to talk about multiplayer. They do have a few guiding stars for multiplayer, and one of them is to avoid seeing players too often or in too high of numbers. They don't want this to feel like an MMO. They still want to capture that action RPG feeling. So here's a bulleted list of takeaways from their playtest. 1, dungeons and key story moments are always private to the player and their party. 2, you'll most likely see people in town once you save a camp or a hub. 3, you're going to see the largest groups of players at world events. You shouldn't see a ton of people all gathered up at one location out in the open world unless there's something going on. 4, you're never forced to join a party. Solo players can show up to a world event, do their thing, still get a reward. And 5, they have group finding tools implemented. That way you can quickly get a group together and be able to go do content. So that's all we know about multiplayer so far. So let's move on to the next thing, items and progression. We didn't get much content for this category outside of a few mentions that Diablo is one of those games that you're always thinking about, right? It's always on your mind. How do I improve my character? How do I improve my build? What gear do I need to get? How could this work? And that really isn't just reserved for Diablo. I feel like that's pretty much every action RPG. I mean, even RPGs in general. Games typically sit in your mind for quite a while. But they did show some images of loot that dropped during their playtest. We saw magic items, rare items, and legendary items. Now, looking at these tooltips, it seems like they're a little light on affixes at first. But when compared to Path of Exile or Grim Dawn, it looks like they almost line up between those two. So looking purely at legendaries or uniques, basically the top rarities for both games, in my opinion, I would prefer Grim Dawn's top-end gear. It feels more impactful, while Path of Exile's best pieces come from crafting most of the time, and they're not unique drops or anything like that, so you actually have to craft almost your best pieces of gear for your particular build, whereas in Grim Dawn and Diablo 3, it's more about the drop. So it's really kind of hard to place a comparison on itemization between these games, because one of them relies on good RNG and good crafting RNG, while the other two rely on good RNG for drops and then RNG on the affixes for that drop. So you kind of have this whole dynamic, but these are the games that people are going to compare against Diablo for. So that wraps up this quarter's update. They mentioned that they're not even at an alpha state yet, so we honestly have a long way ahead of us, guys. A long way. Path of Exile 2 is definitely going to beat Diablo 4 to the punch, in my opinion. But either way, I mean, I'm still excited, right? I still want to see what they're planning. I loved what we saw when they revealed the game. I just want to see more of it. So I'm chomping at the bit, but I want to know your guys' takeaway on this particular update. I mean, did you guys like what you saw? Did you hate what you saw? Let's talk about it. Do you think Diablo 4 is going to be something different than Diablo 3 in terms of playstyle? Do you think it's going to give Path of Exile 2, Path of Exile 1 a run for its money, and are way too early to predict predictions? Let me know what you guys think. Let's talk about it in the comment section below. And as always, thank you so much for the support, guys. This has been Vulkan, and I will talk to you guys next time.